I want to welcome everybody for being here. This is our first webinar for 2021, so I'm absolutely excited. To be honest with you, I was a little nervous. I feel like it's been a while. We had this long break and a lot of things have happened in 2020 and 2021 already. So we're going to jump right into it. But as usual, I would like to share with you guys a little bit about the background. We started since the second week of the shelter in place, this whole COVID happened. The whole purpose is to provide education directly to consumers and then also sharing the information with other real estate professionals as well as empowering our consumers during this very difficult time. And here is like, we have this new year stands before us. It's like a new chapter in a book, right? We're waiting to be written and it's up to us to write something about this year, 2021, what we are going to do. So really want to encourage everybody, if you're working on something that you really care about, you don't have to be pushed. The vision will pull you. Just focus on something that you really love to do. I've been seeing a lot of post on Facebook and we have some moms, parents or some people who have been asking, it's like, oh, I want to do something or find another job. What should I do? And I always tell them, even though I know a lot of people, first things like, okay, let's become realtor. And to be honest with you right now, during this pandemic, there are a lot more people getting their license to become a real estate agents. But most importantly, it's not about looking for a job or a career that can make you a lot of money. Like a lot of people have this kind of misconception in real estate, but it's about you finding something that you really love and care about. Then you don't feel like you're working. I truly love what I'm doing here. I spend hours and hours to do these these research for the presentation, but absolutely love it. So I hope that you guys can do the same thing in 2021. Decide what you love and make that happen for yourself. And today we have invited Joshua Howard. He is the Executive Vice President of the Local Public Affairs for California Apartment Association. And he leads the association's local public affairs strategy, government advocacy, community relations, and political action programs throughout California. And before joining CAA, he served as Vice President of Public Policy and Communications for the San Jose Silicon Valley Chamber of Commerce and as a senior aide to a former San Jose City Council member. Howard is registered lobbyist in several Silicon Valley cities, and he holds a BA degree in political science from Santa Clara University and master's degree in public administration from the University of San Francisco. Well, welcome, Joshua. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, good afternoon, Helen, and thank you for that kind introduction and for that really interesting and valuable information that you were just sharing with all of us. A very dynamic time in real estate, and seeing all the for sale signs popping up in my neighborhood, I know that realtors are staying busy. So let me go ahead and share my screen because I have a quick PowerPoint I'd like to go through with the group.
That would be great.
And hopefully it is there. So let me just, by way of quick background, the California Apartment Association, we're the nonprofit trade association that represents rental housing owners and managers in the state of California. We work very closely with various local governments on different issues impacting rental housing providers and are very tied in and work closely with the state legislature on the numerous issues and the challenges facing the industry, as well as provide comprehensive compliance information to keep rental housing providers up to date on new laws, as well as compliant with the various regulations that affect them. My attorneys require me to just basically say that this is general information. I cannot give you legal advice, and I would encourage you to contact your attorney for very specific legal advice and legal questions you may have. And the material I'm about to present to you is copywritten, and we would ask you to seek CAA's permission to reproduce the information that we're about to share. I think it's important to understand that this past year, 2020, was one of the most challenging years we've seen. As COVID became prevalent and illnesses and deaths began to rise, the governor and city councils were trying to keep the public up to date on what was happening. They were responding very quickly and in real time. And as a result of the public health crisis, the stay-at-home orders, people lost their jobs, lost income, and there was significant pressure that was put on the legislature and our city councils to protect renters, protect tenants, and help those who were at risk of losing their homes. I think what's interesting to note is Zillow did an interesting study a couple of months ago, looking at the industries that were most significantly impacted by the pandemic. And interesting to know that the share of outstanding housing payments and the delinquencies, no surprise, retail, food services, arts and entertainment were some of the most hardest hit sectors by the pandemic, and where we see a great deal of workers in those segments who are behind on their rent or behind on their mortgage. What's also interesting to notice, as of November, the various amount of housing payments that were owed by the various sectors. Again, no surprise that retail, social work, food services, some in education and construction were all significantly impacted. These are statewide numbers, but it really does present that there was, $700, $800 million already cataloged in housing payments that were falling behind after just 7 months of the pandemic. And what's interesting and important to note is that the federal government, and I'll talk about this in a moment, did just allocate, as part of the latest coronavirus relief package, $25 billion in rent relief, 2.6 billion of which is coming to California, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Helen, towards the end of her presentation, talked about rent control and eviction protections. As you all know, as people were at risk of losing their home, falling behind on their rent, cities and counties across the state last year responded by putting different eviction protections in place. This created significant challenges for our court system and significant challenges for rental housing providers. In August of last year, on August 31st, Governor Newsom signed AB 3088. AB 3088 was a bill that was designed to provide some temporary protections to renters who faced eviction for non-payment of rent due to a COVID-impacted hardship. It was also after the Judicial Council, the organization which manages the court system in California, lifted their temporary ban on unlawful detainer actions. I think what's important to note is that AB 3088 was enacted to protect those tenants who were unable to pay their rent and certify that it was due to a COVID hardship. There's significant requirements for owners to provide 15-day notice to their tenants to provide documentation and certify that they were affected. And it also stipulates that the amount of rent that was due between March and August would be considered consumer debt, meaning that the owner could only collect it by going to court, but that tenants from the months of September through January 31st must pay at least 25% of the rent that is due in order to be protected from an eviction. The California Apartment Association responded rather quickly. As you can see, there's numerous forms that an owner must fill out. It requires the landlord to provide a 15-day notice of non-payment of rent rather than the standard 3-day notice. Different notices are required depending upon when the rent or the charges came due, whether it's a charge for rent, whether it's a charge for utilities, whether it's a charge for other fees, and if the property has other federal or state restrictions on it. If you're a member of the California Apartment Association, all of these forms are available on our website. The other piece that AB 3088 did is it expanded eviction protections to all rental properties in California until February 1st of 2021. That means even if you were exempt from the eviction requirements under the statewide rent control law, which was in effect in 2019, single-family homes now, certain SROs, must now fall under this just cause for eviction termination protection. What it means is that everyone has eviction protections immediately across California if they're renters. However, there are some exceptions, and we've created some assistance to help owners. For instance, if the tenant has violated the lease, you would still serve a standard 3-day notice, And then if the tenant doesn't comply with the notice, there's different elements that you would go through if the tenant does not come into compliance with the 3-day notice. In addition, if there is an owner move-in, there is a form and different requirements you must provide to that tenant for an owner move-in from AB 3088. And again, the California Apartment Association has prepared some of the different forms on AB 3088. We have a whole host of materials on our website, which I've presented here on the screen, as well as different webinars and question and answer sessions with our legal counsel that's available on our website. I will tell you, it is very complicated and very long, AB 3088. So I would read through this material carefully if you are affected with a tenant who is unable to pay their rent due to a COVID hardship. I'm going to come back in a moment to sort of what's next for AB 3088 as it does expire at the end of January. But I also want to mention that the California Fair Housing Council, the Fair Employment and Housing Council, is considering some new regulations. They were brought up at the end of last year that would change how you operate your rental housing. They're currently working on regulations that would implement some laws around anti-discrimination for military and veterans, anti-discrimination and new regulations dealing with Section 8 voucher holders, and a law that requires landlords to accept rent and security deposit payments from third parties. The Fair Housing Council is also working on standards for cases alleging discrimination and trying to codify a process for landlords to consider accommodation requests from their tenants. CAA is working very closely with the Fair Employment and Housing Council because these are very significant regulations that are not adopted by the legislature, but adopted by a group of commissioners who've been appointed by different political entities and political figures. Now, really, I think it's important to know what's next. As I mentioned, we are now nearly a year into the pandemic. The stay-at-home orders, the shelter-in-place orders are likely to continue. We see the very sad news every night that our ICU capacity continues to get smaller, and in some parts of the state is at 0. We see that some small businesses have not been able to reopen. They've not been able to bring back all their employees. But we also saw the expansion of federal unemployment that was expanded to $600 a week in 2020 is coming back at $300 a week, but it's still, for some struggling families, not enough. So with the continued economic challenges on the horizon, we expect these stay-at-home orders to continue. Kids are still staying home, distance learning, so parents have to also miss work if they have a job that requires them to be out of the home. So number one is we are excited by the distribution of $2.6 billion in federal aid that is coming to California to help struggling renters. What we understand of this funding, about $1.3 billion of it will be allocated directly to larger cities such as Los Angeles, San Diego, San Jose, cities approximately with a population of over 200 to 250,000 residents. Those cities would each get an allocation that they could distribute, and they would be responsible for coming up with their own program to distribute the funds. We also understand that the other funding would go directly to the state for the state to allocate and distribute. What we are working with the state and the different cities is, number one, we want the funding to be distributed as quickly as possible. The funding should be paid directly to the owners who've certified that they have tenants who are behind on their rent. But we're also trying to work to ensure that there's additional funding available. The federal funding only was available or will only be available to renter households that make below 80% of the area median income. We recognize that there's still quite a number of households that make more than 80% of the area average income who've been affected by the pandemic. So we're working closely and working with the governor's office and the state legislature to allocate additional funds for those more middle to middle high income renters who've been affected by the pandemic and lost income so that they can come current on their rent as well. We believe that by the end of the month, we'll have a more clear understanding of how the funds will be ultimately distributed. We do have a FAQ on the 2.6 billion, which I can send to Helen to send out to those of you who would be interested. So after this call, I will send that to her for those who are interested in how that funding works and much more the mechanics of it. We're also working, I'm going to the last bullet for a second, on property tax relief. We recognize that some rental housing providers have seen a decline in the value of their rental property, primarily due to the adverse or loss of income from declining rent collections. We're working right now with Larry Stone, the Santa Clara County tax assessor, to create a very streamlined Proposition 8 reassessment process so that those owners can petition for a reduction in the value of their asset and ultimately a reduction in their property tax bill outside of the normal petition process. If you're interested in that, I'll also send that to Helen. We're holding a webinar next week with the county tax assessor, and we'll send that to Helen. She can send it to those who are interested. Now, the other piece that's interesting here is AB 3088, the eviction moratorium at the state level. As I mentioned, it expires on January 31st. What that means is if the legislature does not renew AB 3088, then every city across the state of California can adopt their own eviction moratorium, and that would just be pandemonium for the courts. Every court trying to interpret 400 different eviction moratoria statutes, different repayment periods. While we believe it will likely be extended, we are opposed to Assembly Bill 15 by Assemblymember David Chu. He's proposing to extend AB 3088 till the end of 2021. A vaccine is on the way. We believe that, as the economy begins to recover, the vaccine gets further distributed, the federal funds get dispersed and more money made available, we may not need to keep the eviction moratorium in place. There's an alternative which would extend it for a very short period of time, but our number one priority is that if this is to be extended, it needs to be done in very short increments, needs to be reevaluated nearly every 60 to 90 days. But most important is relief needs to come for small property owners, mid-sized property owners, all housing providers, so that those who are behind on their mortgage, behind on their taxes because of declining rent collections can remain whole, their tenants can remain housed. I would say look to the California Apartment Association website if you're not our member. If you are our member, we'll be sending out more information. We expect the legislature in the next 10 days to decide the fate of how they will or will not extend the statewide eviction moratorium. And it's going to be a very complicated process as there are extreme demands being made to extend it, add in additional requirements on owners, which we are fighting because right now housing providers have certainly gone through a lot. They've incurred a lot of deferred rent collections, and so we're trying to bring as much relief to the owners as we can. Our website is caanet.org, and I want to thank you for inviting me to be here today. I know I went through this pretty quickly, but I want to be available for any questions, and I want to extend my gratitude and thanks to Helen and to those of you on this webinar for your support and your interest and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua. That was great, and I definitely have spurred a lot of questions. And I have questions, but I know people have been waiting to ask as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask those questions if that's okay.
Sure.
All right. Well, David has a question here. Whenever applicable, just putting here first, I was told by my peers not to give advice for eviction, but will owner move in evictions just be like how it was? Or tenants are able to use COVID as excuse to bring us to court? House is in Daly City, which is San Mateo County. The city itself provided no answer when I called them.
Well, that's a very specific legal question, but I would say that, as I generally covered in the general comments, that there are provisions in AB 3088 for owner move-in. Helen, I'll send to you, I think it makes most sense to send some of the additional resources we have, which does outline some of the different exceptions to the eviction requirements. And you can send that to the to David or to your other clients.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to let everybody knows, when Joshua sent me these documents, I'll be emailing it over to everybody, and also have a copy on our website under the blog as well. So you guys can download it if you want.
Okay.
Great. And Celine has a question, is what's going to happen when the eviction moratorium expires and tens of thousands of dollars are owed in rent? Will tenants have to pay the full amount back incrementally, or will the debt be forgiven or discharged in bankruptcy? That's one question.
So what I would say is under AB 3088, if the tenant did sign the declaration that they were affected by COVID, the rent from March to August 31st is considered consumer debt, and the owner likely would have to go to court to recover that if they have not worked out a payment arrangement with the resident. The rent from September to January, again, if they did sign the declaration that they were affected by COVID, the tenant is responsible for paying 25% of that rent by January 31st to forestall the eviction proceedings.
You know, that 25%, I always wonder, how did they come up with 25%? I mean, that is not even enough to cover, you know, like maintenance and utilities and all that cost. Is just, but it is what it is. So unfortunately, a lot of landlords,
And that's also why we're really trying to get this federal assistance. I know we call it a down payment on what's owed, trying to get this money distributed as quickly as possible to help the owners who may not be able to make their mortgage next month because they haven't been able to collect rent.
Right, right. Okay, and Celine has another question. So will lawmakers provide relief to landlords who defaulted on their loan due to non-payment of rent abatements, eviction moratorium?
Well, that's been our number one priority. One of the things we are hearing about in Washington now is with the incoming administration is there likely will be additional dollars allocated for both renters and rental housing providers. That's been talked about, and discussions we've heard from Washington, D.C. is that's going to be likely a priority for the next COVID relief bill that will come through the House, Senate, and ultimately to President-elect Biden. We're also working very closely with the state Senate. We understand there's now about a several $billion budget surplus. We're asking that some of those dollars that they've identified as extra money in the budget be made available to renters so they can pay their rent, made available to housing providers so they can pay their bills. And we're also looking at ways we can work with different organizations to find other ways to bring forbearance for rental housing providers on their loans. Those are regulated by the federal government, which is a very different regulatory scheme than the state. But at the same time, some of those loans are also private, and that becomes a very difficult way to engage.
Yeah, and honestly, if these lenders foreclose on the landlords, they are pretty much inheriting this non-performing asset.
Well, what's really scary is if these lenders, and one of the things we've been talking to lawmakers about and regulators about is if you were to ever foreclose on these, let's say a fourplex, a 16-unit building, a new investor will buy it up, and what duty do they have to protect tenants from displacement? So one of the best ways to help these tenants is to help the owners, help the tenants, keep everyone housed, and get these dollars into the hands of the renters to pay their rent as quickly as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely agree. All right, so another question is, how do landlords and tenants prepare for the onslaught of lawsuits that will be filed in court? I think that was one of the things that you had touched on just now as well, especially with all these different regulations.
I would say, everything you do as owners, I would work with your attorney, make sure you're using the right forms, the right documents, but also recognize that the courts are being very judicious. They have requirements for making sure they're not taking on too many cases at one time because of the virus, and they don't want to get people sick. And there's going to be likely a backlog of cases, not just landlord-tenant cases, but other civil disputes as we come through the pandemic.
Yeah, and even though let's say the eviction moratorium really does expire, there's still going to be another round of issues that are come up because of this, just like what you're saying, the backlog. And when are you going to be able to get any of these resolved?
Right. And one of the things I would say, one of the reasons, the statewide legislation was important was we early on saw every city nearly in California adopt their own eviction moratorium. And
Mhm.
each one did it differently. And for instance, the city of Los Angeles adopted a moratorium that stays in place until the city decides to lift its own state of emergency. And then they froze rents on rent controlled units in Los Angeles, and that rent freeze stays in effect until 1 year after the state of emergency is lifted. So so we were really working to get some level of consistency, one for the courts, but two for owners, so there's one standard for everyone to follow.
I might jump in a little bit with my own question is that why do you think, I mean, every time there's these legislation come up, obviously right away, it's like, let's protect the tenants first. And I think in this case, we have to protect the tenants, but at the same time, I have more confidence in our legislators that they should be able to see a lot of these landlords are also suffering. So why is it that the legislations that they propose can be so biased?
Um, it's a very difficult question, and I think it's the shifting demographics, political demographics of California it's become much more of a consumer state. Um, and I think I don't think anyone, just expected the COVID crisis to last as long as it has. I think all of us thought, come June, July of last year, we would start to recover in many ways, and it's gone on a lot longer.
Mhm.
Um, and so now it's having those tough conversations with local and state lawmakers. Everyone recognizes that owners are struggling. I was in a discussion today with a city council member in a different city, and she's someone who's been very consumer oriented and tenant friendly, and she was very concerned about what does this mean long term for owners, and how can the city help
Mhm.
the owners with whether it's short-term loans, whether it's rental assistance, fee forgiveness, other abatement. So there is a recognition that owners need help. Otherwise, the owners will have no choice but to sell or potentially lose their asset to the bank. And these are primarily individuals who put their 401k into the fourplex, or they put
Yeah.
their kids' college savings into the 8-unit building and are expecting it to be there for them. So there is a recognition that the owners need assistance, and it's,
Mhm.
I think, finally coming to light the magnitude of the issue for the policymakers. And with the money coming from the federal government, hopefully money coming from the state and then some cities have put in their own money as well. It will
Absolutely.
be important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just that every time we talk about these small landlords, I just know when you talk about it, I got goosebumps thinking about how many of these clients of ours have saved up all their lives just so that they want to,
Right.
I mean, one of the reasons to be a landlord is not because, oh, I want to be greedy, I want to take money from tenants, is because they want to build a financial security for themselves as well. So yeah, I hope that we will definitely see more of different legislations come up to help
And
landlords
that's
as
why
well.
it's important, Helen, for property owners to call their legislators. And I would, I'll send, we're going to be sending out some information to our own members. I'll make sure you receive it as well. And you could ask your clients to engage with this, to call their local legislator and
Mhm.
remind them that, while you're working on all these eviction moratorium and tenant protections, please include funding for small property owners.
Absolutely. It's important for reminding everybody, make sure you call your legislators to voice your opinion, voice your requests as well.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Celine, for all those questions. David, you have another question. Is that, do you think housing price inflation can be resolved by having more newly built construction to be for sale instead of for lease? I noticed a lot of newly built apartments and condos are for lease only and not for sale. And the HOA for those is so high, it made no effect for flattening the housing inflation. What do you think about the HOA? I don't know if you have any thought about that. I can chime in as
The
well.
only thing I will say is the more housing we build, the right areas, and focus on making sure there's a good balance of rental housing, for sale housing, it does help with the long-term affordability challenges.
Mhm.
I can't speak to HOAs and from the planned unit developments that I know that the person is asking about, but ultimately, the more housing we build, with the it does increase the supply, addresses the issues of demand, which is why we're seeing right now rental prices are coming down as people have left the area, have lost their job, or are consolidating. There's a lot more units available for rent right now, and because of that, I've heard from some owners that their rents are as low as they were back in 2008.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, yeah, I've definitely seen some of my clients that have dropped their rental prices for about 25%, 30%.
Yeah.
So if it's vacant right now, it has some challenges, and a lot of tenants are renegotiating back on their leases. But yeah, I absolutely agree with Joshua, is that if they increase, keep building more housing, it definitely can resolve the prices. Unfortunately, the HOA, it really depends on the amenities. I think a lot of developers are building these higher end constructions, which will obviously have a higher HOA. Also, is that the biggest issue is that why aren't we building as quickly, because of the regulations for every single city, and also the cost to build is so high and make it very difficult for developers, and developers become very picky on like which area they're willing to build, because the regulation is a little bit easier to get permit and have less cost. So yeah, there's so many factors which we want to encourage development, but I think a lot of these laws actually is discouraging, unfortunately.
And that does happen. I mean, especially with the high cost of land, the various costs for infrastructure with sewer and park and roadways, and also just the uncertainty right now with the labor market and the housing market. But if there were, I've heard in some instances, some developers have had to take 2 to 3 years to get a project approved, and then there's challenges from different neighborhood groups who don't like change in their neighborhood, and they don't like added density. So there's a whole layering of factors, Helen, but ultimately we have to make sure we're finding the right places to build. The cities are being open and willing and accepting of the growth and the density, and especially as things begin to rebound, because everything I'm reading, and you alluded to it in your economic discussion, a lot of these jobs will likely come back. It's not because the fundamentals of the economy are broken. It's people who can't leave their house and go spend money, which means people can't always work. So we might see a quick, and I think the slide you shared with about rent prices going up at a certain, like late 21, early 22, does indicate that means demand for housing will start going up.
Absolutely. And Valerie, I saw you have a question. Has anyone asked the lawmakers how we are expected to find a tenant once he leaves owing us thousands of dollars, or are getting a right to reevaluate their credit and job worthiness to remain in the property as their circumstances and covenants change?
Well, that's an interesting issue, and I think that's why it's important right now with the tenants who are behind on their rent to follow the laws, follow the protocols, document the issues, but also serve them the appropriate notices. And that way, if you do need to take them to small claims court or get a judgment, that is likely the best way to be able to move forward if they can't come current or you can't work out an arrangement with them.
Yeah. And David asks again, for Prop 19 regarding inheritance, how long does the transferee have to use it as primary before being able to rent it out?
I'm going to send that one back to you, Helen, because that's more of a realtor question.
Yeah, well, this is a relatively new. I would even double check with an attorney regarding this. I would think it's about a year, usually typically a year qualify as a private. But again, I don't know exactly the answer. It's better to ask an attorney about this question. All right. And Mary, hi, Mary. Is there a website that updates or gives landlord property managers information about when the federal aid to help with back grants is available and how to apply for those funds?
Well, through the California Apartment Association, as soon as we have more information, we're going to keep our website updated on that. And I do know, for instance, the city of San Jose, we had a meeting with them earlier this week. They want to roll out a really robust outreach program to owners once they get their allocation of the funding. So I would say, based on the city that you're in, I would definitely check with that city if they're getting a direct allocation. CAA, our website, will also be promoting as much information as we can to owners about how to apply for the different programs.
Great. And that's actually Anna, not Mary. Thank you so much. All right. And Jane, sorry if I mispronounced your name, Sarab. You referred to a multifamily prop in Stockton that has been on the market quite long. Is that normal for Stockton? If not, do you think the slowdown is specific to Stockton or more general to the multifamily market? Yes, so that's a great question. It's general in the multifamily market, I would say, is because that a lot of, we talked about this before in the previous episodes, is that a lot of sellers are still saying like, hey, look, we are getting rent and I have no issues. But then the buyers would say, well, I don't know, there's eviction moratorium. What if after I bought it, the tenants move out? So a lot of buyers are still very nervous about making an offer on these properties. And that's why the multifamily market has been slow, and a seller feels like I am still getting the rent. I'm not going to come down on the price, while the buyer is saying like, I'm not going to come up on the price to meet where you want. So we have this gap between the seller and the buyer. And that's the reason why a lot of these apartments, you will see that they are, they're sitting on the market a little bit longer. But if the seller is willing to come down, there are still a lot of buyers with a lot of cash and reserve that are willing to purchase a property right now. So, and there's actually a lot of questions in the chat. I just see that. Maybe see if I can scroll up. I'm not sure if I can go back to, it seems like there's quite a lot. Hi, Josh. Much of the data is based on loan payment stats, but many mom and pop properties are free and clear, thus providing income for basic needs of those owners, supplementing their retirement incomes with non-paying rent tenants and non-eviction restrictions. What to do? Is there potential for public money support to go directly to them? I think you can answer that question earlier.
Yeah.
Yep, great.
And our goal is to make sure that the back rent dollars go as directly to the landlord as possible, and then that serves as a credit towards the back rent.
Right. And is I think this is Anna, and said, how can they pay back rent when they cannot pay us current rent? How can CAA help people get back to work? Then they can pay their rent. Is there any help for this?
Let's get that vaccine out there as quickly as we can.
I agree. I mean, honestly, if we can all work together to stop the spread, that's all I can say. If we can, no matter how much you hate or love masks, whatever it is, like the most important thing is just stop the spread. Then maybe we can back to normal. Yeah, I cannot believe we're still in here. Do we have an idea the percentage of us tenant landlord rent payment struggle, or is this the only area specific? I'm asking to understand whether the percentage might cause of housing struggle, which could lead to housing crash. I think it's talking about the percentage of how many tenants really struggling on the rent payment. Do we have like a number?
There's a study that's supposed to come out. I think it's coming out later today or tomorrow that will have some of that information.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also interesting. I know that the stats you shared, Helen, from the National Multi-Housing Council, that there's about 93, 94%. I'm hearing on average, on the larger portfolios, it's in the mid 90s. And then it's much different on like the Class B, Class C properties. I think it's difficult to tell because every owner is dealing with it a little bit differently.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it really depends on if the owner is really working with the tenants. Mm-hmm. And let's just put it out there, is that we always worry about like certain tenants will take advantage of these programs and not paying rent, right? But at the same time, most of the tenants, they're great people, really hardworking people. They want to pay their rents. They're very responsible. So I still think that most renters, we want to help them out. And same thing for landlords. Of course, not every single landlord, they are very nice people, but most landlords, they really want to help the tenants as well. So yeah, that's why I liked looking at that tracker, saying that is actually 95% of the tenants have been paying. If you look at the full month, obviously mm-hmm. the first week usually it's about 70-80%, but if you look at full months, it's over 90%. All right, Alfred has a question. Tenant who is not paying rent is threatening to file bankruptcy would take them to court. In such case, there's no way to recoup any rent, even if you spend tens of thousands on legal fees. How do you deal with such issues?
I am not an expert in the bankruptcy court or bankruptcy laws. I would definitely consult your attorney about what options might be available.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to have a attorney to answer these questions too. Yeah, I absolutely know what you mean. We had a client who have that experience.
Yeah.
What's puzzling me is housing prices are so strong, but then we are faced with tenant non-payment, which leads to landlord non-paying to default. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's the residential. I think the owner occupied properties is very strong, and that's also another thing is that when we see a lot of rental units are, we're saying like a lot of tenants are moving out and living somewhere else. There's also, I also think about it's like because they are tenants, they're not really tied to the property. If I'm renting right now, I would say, yeah, I'm going to Hawaii. I'll rent a place in Hawaii and work there until I have to go back to work. So to me, I think at the end of the day, they might come back and and come back when everything's open up. So not necessarily that all these tenants are really moved out for good. And that's why we
Right.
see the rent might come back up.
Well, and you shared the headline from Marcus and Millichap about Fresno and the Central Valley. That market is doing, everyone always in Silicon Valley, I know people make, little jokes about why would I move to Fresno, but it's a lot less expensive comparatively speaking. And if one doesn't have to go to the Googleplex or the Apple campus every day, and they're working from home, they can reduce their housing costs significantly going somewhere else until they have to come back to the area.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, a few months ago, I did another stat. I cannot remember exactly the number now, but looking at how much people actually saved in the bank, the bank deposits had increased quite a bit because a lot of people have been saving money.
Mhm.
This is time when you can really try to save money when you cannot go anywhere. And I think in the channel, okay. And Anna, how many tenants in San Jose are not paying the rent in full? I have a friend in San Francisco who said 50% are not paying. I don't know exactly how many tenants in San Jose are not paying rent in full. um, this is in Chinatown, San Francisco. Yeah, I'm not sure, but again, from what the property managers, the landlords that I've been talking to, I haven't seen such a big number, 50% not paying. A lot of times I hear it's always single digits and not even the 30% that a lot of news have been reporting. So yeah, I'm surprised 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this was great. Oh my gosh, that was definitely a lot of questions. Thank you so much, Joshua, for being here and answering all these questions for us. I think this is one of the most active Q&A ever.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that was a
Good.
lot of questions. I think this is a very sensitive topic in a sense because we are coming up to that January 31st eviction moratorium expiration. What do you think that is it? When do we know? Is it going to be extended for
Well, the
sure?
legislature is on recess right now until Friday, and they're back on Friday. We'll likely know I think a clearer picture probably next week of where things are headed. But, they have to get something done by January 31st. And, I think if history is a guide, we'll probably see something happen towards the last few days before the deadline.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. They always wait until the last few days and then we'll find out. So, well, I hope you guys enjoy.
We'll keep you posted. We'll keep our members informed, especially if there might be opportunities or need to call or write legislators on certain issues.
Yeah, that would be great. I think it is important. And if you're on this call, I really highly encourage you guys to jump on and make the calls and help each other out on this, because I think a lot of times we hear a lot from the tenant support group, and I think we do need to have a stronger voice. And CAA, for example, they of course doing their best, but still we need a lot of voices from the landlords, from the real estate professionals to help out.
Yeah.
Well, in conclusion, I hope today you guys all enjoyed all the information we have shared. To summarize what we have shared today, 1 to 4 units in residential market in Bay Area is still very strong. We still expect the price to continue to be strong. No housing crash in sight right now in the Bay Area. Mortgage rate will inch up a little bit throughout this year, but it's still going to go up a little bit. condo prices drop, maybe it is a good time to buy. And rent prices, we talked about it, it dropped. And as an apartment seller, if you're really gonna sell, you definitely need to be a little bit, maybe less aggressive on the pricing, be more conservative because the buyer's expectation is different now from last year, from 2019. And there are a lot of real estate practice change that I think I'm actually a little bit quite excited about it, because I feel like now without the open houses, we're really allowing real estate agents and the home buyers working together to look at the house, to be more, to give you the advice. So this is elevating the real estate standard, and I'm excited about that. Don't just remember, just don't invest blindly. Don't just say, you're going to pay a price for the property. You are paying for the value of the property. Don't gamble. Do your research, do your analysis. Don't speculate. That's the number one rule for real estate investment. This is not stock. And let's focus on solutions instead of, the problems here. And I hope that till next time, you guys will come back, and we're going to have another different topic to talk about. Thank you again, Joshua, and have a good night. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and also come back often to check out our new videos. And also every second Wednesday of the month from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific time, we will be doing our Bay Area Housing Market Town Hall and bring to you a lot of great speakers and to share a lot of real estate information. And I look forward to see you back. Bye.